Well, thank you very much, Ladi. We are discussing a little more business now because at the beginning of this year, we saw the rounds made by the MD, or like I said, the CEO of MTN Communications, speaking generally about what the position of the telecoms industry was going to be and how they were going to be needing a 100% tariff increase, or at least there had to be an increase of some sort in that particular sector, arguing that tariffs had largely remained same since 2013, yet cost of operations had been going up, and so we knew that something was in the offing for consumers of telecom services. Well, it's now come to play. The NCC, the National Communications Commission, has now approved a 50% tariff increase. What will that mean for you and I? Well, I know almost every single Nigerian now has a mobile telephone in his or her hand. Now, if you're not even using a mobile telephone network, sometimes they're consumers of data. How is that going to impact the consumer and the consumption of telecom services? Joining us this morning to discuss it is Mr. Bosun Ayeni, who is the CEO of Compumetrics, and he joins us via Zoom. Mr. Ayeni, it's good to see you this morning. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mope. Thank you for having me. Good morning.
So they asked for a 100% increase, but were granted a 50% increase. Do you see this? How do you see this playing out for both the operator and consumers as well? Do you think this is a good enough middle ground?
Of course, thank you, Mope, for that question. Of course, the telcos will take it. Middle ground for the operators and the regulator, but certainly not a middle ground for consumers. As you know, Nigeria is the whole of 2024 passing through a lot of economic situationship that the government is working really hard to reverse and make things more comfortable for the citizens. I mean, from multidimensional poverty to all the indicators. So this would be another nail. We just hope it's not the final nail to the coffin and all the nails will go off at some point. But for consumers, it will be more cost, more flashing, more could you send me airtime and all of that. So that will play out for the consumers. But for the operators, yes, it's a demand that's justified in a way, because if you look at the situation, 10 years, 12 years is a long time to keep costs at the same level in Nigeria. But it's not unusual in telecom services. There are so many factors that will determine whether an increase should come in. But in Nigeria, and given what has happened, especially in the last 24 months, definitely something has to give. Most of the cost inputs, and if you look at the books of these operators, they are sweating cash. A lot of them are declaring losses, and a lot of it is coming from loans, debt, and foreign exchange losses. So if you look at MTN books, for example, it's on their website. MTN, as at September 2024, has declared a 900 billion naira loss due to exchange rate. 900 billion. All the states in Nigeria, their IGR in 2023 is 22.4 trillion. So, and the entire IGR of Lagos State, the entire for the whole of 2023 is 800 billion, 815. So the losses that MTN alone has incurred from FX in 2023 and 2024 as at September is more than what Lagos State has sent in Nigeria. So something has to give. The telcos would make a demand. The regulator would look at it. But there are other perspectives on the regulator side as well. Yes, middle ground. Yes, you shift. And we have to take the argument of the regulator on face value. It's been a long time coming. They've held out for quite a long time. But certainly acceding to the request now is something they also have to do. Of course, the argument have been It would improve investment in the economy to enable the operators to provide better services. These, of course, are altruistic arguments, and they are true. At the same time, the regulator also earns income and fees from the performance of the telcos. So if the telcos are not doing well, the operators will not earn sufficient fees. So yes, it is a fair middle ground from the perspective of the operator and the regulator. For the consumers, it's moving us further down the line. But very little option at this point.
I was a little curious, when I started hearing this, this talk around increase in tariff, and the fact that the regulator had to approve the fact that before any of the telcos could increase tariff, because here's what they were asking for: 100% increase. If you were to if everybody were to ask for 100% increase, we've experienced that already. In fact, with petrol, it was not 100% increase; it was well over 100% increase. Electricity tariff, I think we got up to 300% increase in electricity tariff. Now telcos are asking, or they were asking for 100% increase. You've talked about just how much MTN lost as a company, as an entity. When you also look at the average position of a Nigerian vis-a-vis FX, if you were to look at how much maybe you were worth yesterday vis-a-vis how much you're worth today, with what had happened with the devaluation of the naira, they're not exactly in a position to absorb all the shocks that we were seeing with all of these increases in very critical sectors: power, communications, energy. These are the areas that we have now seen this tariff. How would you say that? Because on the one hand, while the telecom companies can ask for this and do this, it certainly will have an impact on the ability of consumers to continue to be able to afford their products, particularly rural consumers. Maybe we shouldn't go there just yet. Let's even talk about the average consumer. How do you think that the average consumer is going to be able to absorb this latest shock to their spending?
Well, people would dig in and look at the spectrum of consumer behavior. So it will be your amount of disposable income, your physiological or psychological and sociological composition of different segments of consumers. Some will not be bothered. They will go on with their business as usual. Some will even spend more. But we would expect the majority of consumers to begin to adopt measures to reduce consumption so that they can balance or hopefully maintain a consistent spend in terms of cash outlay. But, the interesting component, and you're right, with the situation in Nigeria and all the major sectors and the changes we are seeing and would continue to see. And if you look at it from a consumer perspective, I'm particularly happy that the President Bola Tinubu of Nigeria, eventually agreed, at least for some time, to slow down on the implementation of the tax reform bills. Because what would have happened is that the pressure on Nigerians would have simply increased. VAT is going to be going up. Luckily for telco fees, when you buy a recharge card, the fee that the telco sets already includes VAT, and I hope they would maintain that standard going forward with the price review. So whatever price the NCC approves now is already VAT inclusive. That's the way telco fees operate. But broadly speaking, for consumers, it's tougher times ahead. From all government predictions, hopefully by 2026, 2027, 26, 27, hopefully, things will begin to slow down and take shape. We hope that this president would fix a number of these issues before the end of his first tenure, so that he stands a better chance to come back to office, which of course he has the privilege and opportunity to do that. But one of the arguments we would typically hear would be to compare price increases, given that it's not been done in 10, 12 years, with what's happening in other, especially developing economies. It is true that in 10 to 12 years, most developing economies have increased tariffs a couple of times, almost everybody else. But what is not true is to compare that with two indicators, for example. What is the cost, for example, of 1 gigabit of data in most developed economies? So what has happened in Nigeria now with this pronouncement by NCC is that it brings our average cost to the same level with countries, most landlocked Eastern countries in Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda. Of course, we are still far off from what are obtainable in South Africa, which is about $1.7. So this change would take Nigeria's cost to about $60 per 1 gigabit of data. But if you compare that with what's obtainable in 60 cents, I beg your pardon, for 1 gigabit of data. If you take that to what's obtainable in India, for example, it's still around 9 cents, 10 cents. So while India in the last 2, 3, 4 years have increased tariff, say 3, 4 times, but they are still below 10 cents. And Nigeria, we're moving from about 32 cents for 1 gigabit of data on the average to 64. So, and we know what it is with, income rate and all of that. And it will interest you to know more about that. Now, with this increase, we will be paying the same rate as United Kingdom customers. These guys are in pounds. It's easy to argue that their taxes and all of the cost component are much higher. But an average skilled person in the UK, on a dollar per dollar basis, would earn maybe 10 times what the equivalent in Nigeria is earning. But their cost profile are gradually becoming the same. Transportation, diesel, housing, now telecoms. So we are moving our cost of living to the level of so many economies, while the ability to earn is not the same. So this is the challenge that consumers will continue to face in 2025.
And it's a really big challenge indeed. I'm just a little curious because you talked about how other countries, they had been gradually increasing their own tariff. Up to where we are, where they are currently. We have not done this. Why do you think that it has taken so long for us to see this increment? Do you think that if telecom companies had been gradually increasing, would this be so much of a shock? Because all that has happened now, yes, we have seen incidences in the last 2 years thereabout that has seen an increase in many other places. But one would argue that the cost of production for some time now had been going up already for telecom companies. For instance, their base station, they power it on diesel. Diesel has been deregulated for a very long time now, and one would have thought that would have been reflected in some of their price increments, which would have been happening over time. Do you think that the NCC was being too restrictive, or did the telecom companies think that they could cope?
Well, it's a number of factors. First is that ultimately telecoms is regulated. So fixing price within certain band is determined by the regulator. And last year, the new or the current EVC of NCC passed a simplified, harmonized tariff program, which it's a good thing. NCC has been one of the flagship, in fairness to them, regulatory agencies in the country, and they continue to be among the top 3, top 5 outstanding regulatory agencies in the country. But on this one, there are certain changes that I believe the NCC needs to make. Yes, the increase should have been gradual. A 50% single leap is almost unacceptable. It's a huge leap. It's true. The conversation starting publicly and making it happen maybe 2-3 months. I think it's huge. NCC could borrow a leaf from what the electricity regulator is doing, make a 2-year incremental pronouncement, work with the operators to make that happen. And to interest you to know that why has it not happened all this while? Yes, I'll tell you a simple reason. Look, we all remember how MTN celebrated when they came into Nigeria. The financial projections that MTN made rolling out their first network was that they will recover in about 5 to 10 years or thereabout. And they broke even and began to make profits in the first year. So Nigeria and the opportunities that it presents is huge. Even today, in spite of the losses, Malpe, MTN's financial report for 2020 last year, last 3 quarters, is still operationally. Even today, the company on its own it's profitable. So what is the challenge they are facing? It is the exchange regime policy of government. I wouldn't want to say of the current government or the previous government, but it is the sudden changes in exchange rate regime that has put MTN and most of these operators in the situation they find themselves. Now, if you look at the banks on the flip side, maybe because they are a financial institution, they took advantage of the policies, and all the banks, or majority of them, declared such huge profit from exchange rate gains that the federal government had to consider, passing a special tax on those gains. But if you look at most of the other industries, telco, manufacturing, and all of that, they don't have the expertise that financial services organizations have. So Mr. Jen took a hit from the exchange rate policy. So this is where they are losing money from. And I think it's high time that telcos also began to look at their business model. You're right. BTS, the base station cost, is the biggest single element for telcos. And if you look at it, the cost between last year, 2023, which they've declared, and 2024, more than doubled, which is reflective of the changes in exchange rate. So the question is, isn't there something they can begin to do, a newer model, a better restructuring? Shouldn't NCC begin already to sit with the telcos and look at the models they operate? Because what they've simply done is to outsource most of this functionality to other entities, which some in the industry say they're, well, let me leave the investment model and all of that. But other entities that they then subscribe. The challenge is that all this cost, or most of it, are dollar denominated.
Okay. Well,
of course, we don't want to dollarize the economy, but that's the situation we find ourselves.
Okay. Well, Mr. Ayemi, just one thing bothers my mind. Well, a number of things actually, but first of all, is whether or not you think the increase, this hike in telcos services will invoke inflation, if you think it will spur inflation one way or the other. And secondly, if you can put both in the same response. Part of the promise made, and that's been the story over time, that we're increasing the price, telco services prices, with the hope that we'll be able to increase or improve on QoS. Do you see that happening this time around?
I mean, cash is king, right? With the increase, the cash position and cash situation of all telcos will improve. And their cost profile would remain at existing trajectory. So definitely almost all telcos, without exception, should be able to do better. They should be able to invest more. That's why I said the argument of NCC or TruSic, yes. Now, telco, the sector contributes about 9% to GDP at the moment. With the increase, perhaps maybe 11, 12%. We'll see what plays out at the end of 2025. Now, direct impact on inflation. That I will leave to specialist economics. But this is what I would say. I believe that disposable income is what would make people determine what they do with phone calls. Today, about 55% of telco revenues is in data. Only about 35% is in voice calls. And the utilization, people would argue that almost 40-50% of data utilization in Nigeria is for frivolous and some P-word use that are not for real economic activities. So will people adjust their consumption to reflect the new cost pattern? Or if people maintain their cost consumption levels for data and voice, I see the impact on inflation not to be that significant. Personal view, given that people would prioritize other more critical spending to making calls and using data. But quality of service, yes, it's hopeful that that would step up, but it will not happen by default. The telco has to be deliberate. I mean, the regulator this time has to be deliberate and intentional in monitoring what needs to happen. And I wouldn't even take the bet on quality of service. I would expect the regulator to give Nigerians more tangible things. For example, when most people call public institutions and call public services, they pay to make those calls. If you have an issue with your bank and you're calling to resolve the issue, you're most likely calling on a line that you are paying for. So the regulator, NCC, can sit with the telcos and say, okay, we're allowing this increase. What if you reduce your fee on inbound calls to businesses and public institutions, so that people can be encouraged, these entities can be encouraged to adopt toll-free lines. If they adopt toll-free lines and the fees that the entity who subscribe to the telcos for these lines is also reduced significantly as part of the broader negotiation, it gives people some relief. So at least if you are having to make critical mandatory calls to hospitals, to federal institutions, to state institutions, to local government, to banks, to all public institutions and corporate, your cost of doing that is reduced. So if you don't want to choose, as Maokwe would not compromise, and I would not compromise, if you then choose to spend 6 hours calling your partner or other social calls, I mean, that's up to you. But mandatory calls that people need to make can be reduced if they make those interventions.
Are you hopeful? I mean, since you say you're hopeful on the issue of QoS, quality of service, as a good number of people who have been told that we tried to reach you, we couldn't reach you, that quality of service, particularly of calls, is a huge concern. That's the basis of that question. So what's the assurance we have, for instance, that there is going to be any significant infrastructure improvement in rural areas, for instance? We are still struggling with 5G in urban Nigeria, and I'm not sure we have 2G all across the country at this point. So do you see this increase affecting anything significantly in terms of infrastructure for telecommunication?
Well, again, there are no assurances, but this is what I'll say. As this increase coming, the telco's ability to pay their regulatory fees will improve. So on the regulator side alone, for example, I think in MTN's book, they have about between 70 or 90 billion naira in regulatory fees. Hopefully, all of that money is going to NCC. MTN paying regulatory fees should all go to NCC in last year. And that's as a third quarter. So if their performance improves, their payments to regulator would improve. And there is also a special intervention fund, USPF, that the NCC and the Ministry of Digital Economy manages. And this is also largely from profit from operators. So as all of this happen, the ability now of government through NCC and the Ministry of Digital Economy to provide interventions, which they already do it, by the way. USPF provides so many interventions in higher institutions and all of that to improve broadband penetration. I think the Minister of Digital Economy is pursuing this ambitious goal to roll out 90,000 kilometers of fiber. I wish him all the luck. The fund for it has begun to come in from what we see in the news. Again, hopefully, before they leave office, we will see traction. So the increase, USPF funding certainly should increase better than before the increase. Regulatory payment to NCC should increase before this price change. So putting all that together, their ability as regulator to intervene and as government to intervene, it's definitely enhanced. Now, on the telco side, this is my position. All regulated entities, you have to assume as a regulator that they would not on their own do everything they should do to improve quality of service. So the only guarantee, the only entity that can give a guarantee is NCC, because they have to improve and sharpen their regulatory oversight and measures to ensure this happens. And they need to make certain commitment. So NCC has to come up beyond saying that it will improve quality of service. So they should make specific public pronouncement that call drop rates will change from this current level to this current level, and then hold the industry accountable to those standards. So perhaps that would then increase my level of certainty to say this will happen. But surely there will be some improvement.
If you can intervene on this one, I wanted to ask you about rural penetration, because that's one of the areas that the federal government is also looking towards. How do you think this core tariff hike will affect rural penetration and the ability of rural people to be able to afford their services?
Affordability for rural people would remain what it is. They would not be able to afford it. We wait to see how, at the end of the government investment and, for example, the fiber route, if government continue aggressive policy inducement that would enable differentiated tariff by the telcos, for example, government could sit down, regulator could sit down with the telcos and say, in rural areas, we want you to maintain the current fee. If possible, even reduce them. And in urban areas, excuse me, in urban areas, yeah, go ahead with the increase. So these are some of the measures they can take. But as it is today, unless those positive policy inducements are done by the government through the regulators, the telco will charge their standard tariff everywhere. They've done certain promotions. For example, a number of the telcos have done...
I'm afraid we're totally out of time. I mean, I think I'm going to take your last sentence, that perhaps they can do a differentiated tariff, or we'll see if that will apply in this particular instance. We have to thank you so much for your intervention on the conversation this morning. Mr. Bosun Ayeni is the CEO of Compumetrics, and he joined us via Zoom here in Abuja. Thank you so much for being a part of the program.
Thank you for having me. Have a nice day.
And that's where we wrap up the conversation this beautiful Tuesday morning. Thank you to our viewers for being a part of it. You can send us a message on any of the topics that have been of interest to you. Thank you for watching. I'm Malpa Ogun Yusuf. Have a great day.
Ayo Makinde, do have a productive day.